So by now I'm writing stuff for theatre restaurants because that's where the money was. So I always liked doing that. And I had a friend at uni who was a musician, Paul Grabowski.
Yeah,
and Paul Grabowski was incredibly talented musician. Paul had topped his VCE or HSC year for the state. Very bright guy. But he'd been at Wesley and he'd been a gifted pianist. So good that he got into Melbourne Uni, into the con, and I think he ended up being a jazz tutor in his first year. So he's 17 and he's tutoring in jazz piano at the con. But Paul has no interest in attending lectures, and I was a bit the same. Paul's supposed to be studying music, and he's doing gigs left, right and centre, doing jazz gigs around Melbourne, and he's gifted, so everyone wants to see him play. And he's put bands together, so he doesn't turn up to anything. And in fact, I think he riles the faculty because the dean of the faculty, who's a classical pianist, has just ordered this new Steinway that's taken a year to arrive from Germany and has been hand-built to his specifications. And they're about to do an inaugural concert with the brand new Steinway at Melbourne Uni. And it's, Bach's such and such. And it was a very... all the luminaries were coming down to see this concert. They've come into the hall where it's all set up. The dean with about 12 other people, and he's proudly showing the vice-chancellor. He's brought them in. And there's Paul up on the stage, thumping out all these jazz standards and mucking around and thumping the thing. And the dean's literally had conniptions. So I didn't think that fared too well in Paul's sort of stay at Melbourne Uni in the music department. So he was sort of half enrolled and half playing gigs around Australia and internationally. So Paul and I became good friends, and we wrote 4 or 5 kind of, they were musicals that went on in these theatre restaurants. I remember one we wrote, which was actually not bad, but it was funny, and it was this was at the time when disco was big. So we wrote a musical called Slipped Disco. It's a play on words there, John. And it had a good cast, but it had David Argue was a very funny performer. It had a cast of about 6 or 7 and had, a dozen songs in it. But we wrote several musicals at that time, just for fun, and we got paid for it.
And you still continue to write commercial musicals with Paul to this day.
Yeah.
And in Hour 17, we'll get to that.
In Hour 17, we'll pick that up once we move out of 1987.
We're getting closer to TV.
Yeah.
In 87, you were a producer and writer on a film called The Bit Part, and it had a roll call of famous Australian performers. And one of the leads was a young lady, Nicole Kidman.
Yeah, so I thought, how hard can it be? This shows you how naive and how kind of arrogant we were. I thought, and also we're just creatively inspired. So I thought, let's write a.
Were you still a lawyer at this stage?
I was being a lawyer now, and so I thought, but in my spare time I was writing a lot. So I thought, I wouldn't mind writing a film. So I wrote a film script about a teacher who really wants to be, and maybe there was something kind of prophetic about it, or maybe about a teacher who really wants to be an actor. And so he sort of gives up his teaching career. He's a good teacher and becomes an actor. But the only parts he can get are minor parts, basically as an extra. There was kind of a young love interest in it, played by a young actress called Nicole Kidman. So it was one of her first movies, and it was a good movie. And Paul Grabowski wrote the soundtrack for it. Great job. Vince Jones sang the lead song in it, and I think I was nominated for best screenplay at the Writers Guild Awards.
How do you do this when you're not qualified, as it were, in film?
Just have a go. In the same way as we weren't qualified to write plays. I mean, what does it take to be qualified? You read up, you study, you look and learn, and then you have a go. and you learn on the way through. I mean, I'm a great believer in doing courses and reading. I do all the time, but I'm also a great believer in having a go. There was, I forget which great screenwriter who'd won several Academy Awards for Best Screenplay, was asked, people would come and say, how do you become a writer? And they'd want to spend time with him. But the first thing he would do is he'd give them a document. He'd say, see that? And they'd look at it and they'd say, yeah, well, it's actually the screenplay of Casablanca. And they'd think he was going to say, well, could you go and just read that? Which they were happy to go and do. And what he'd say is, go away and type it up. Literally copy type the script from Casablanca. And so they'd go, why? And he'd say, just do it. And what he was basically saying is, in the doing of that, you will learn about how you set up a scene, how long it should run for, how much dialogue is in it, how much action is in it as opposed to speaking, what the breakdown of scenes is between action scenes and dialogue scenes, how many people come and go, what's manageable, all the mechanics of a film you will be taught in the most excellent way from that script. So just go and do it. So they'd come back a week later and say, now, do this one. You give them the Maltese Falcon or something else. So they'd go and type that up. But there's a lot to be said for that. You know, people are looking for these tips, but just do the hard work of the mechanical stuff. But there's something else too, I think, about writing, John, and that is, people always say, I want to be a writer. Like there's some trick to it. But I'd always say, well, yes. What have you written? Well, I haven't written anything right now, but if someone were to commission me or give me, well, no. My experience is that all the people who succeed in whether it's screenwriting or whatever are going to do it kind of anyway. They're literally going to do it anyway as writers. They're writing all the time. They've always got ideas. And yes, it's good to be, for it to be picked up and channeled and taken, but it's kind of what they would do in any event. Just do it kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think we're in a more risk-averse world, though, now.
And there are so many bits, too. You know, as the more complicated the medium, the more working bits there are. So, you know, that doesn't mean you can make it happen, but anyone can get a bit of paper and write some ideas down, and anyone can get a laptop and write a script up. You don't need a huge organization around you to do that. And all that information about what does a script look like, what can be in it, that's all available now. So anyone can do that. It's just whether you're prepared to do it or not.
And so how did you take all that and parlay into TV?
I was still writing, being a lawyer, and there was an opportunity that arose. It must have been in about 1985, I reckon. That's a long time ago. So I was in my late 20s. I was still in my 20s as a lawyer, and I was a partner in a law firm. I'm supposed to be concentrating on law, Jesus. And so I'm writing sketches in my spare time and selling them. The Australian Film Commission, through a very famous producer called Bob Weiss, who'd produced these great dramas, you know, mini-series, and like one was called the De Niro Boys, another was called Waterfront, had Brian Brown and Jack Thompson and Greta Scacchi and other people in it. They're really excellent mini-series and drama series. But he had a view that there was a lot of he saw what we saw. There was a lot of, but he had authority. There was a lot of comedic talent going around. So he went to the Australian Film Commission, as it was at the time, and said, what you should do is put some money up and get a few of these people to do stuff for TV. They're doing it in theatre. Why not do it for TV? So he held some workshops, and a UK writer-producer came out. Of course, it had to be from overseas to tell us what to do, and held some workshops about writing for TV. I don't think I went to those. And then he rang up a few of us and said, listen, I think I can get a show or an opportunity at Channel 7, and they'll put on a limited series, and it'll be kind of half funded by the AFC and half funded by Channel 7, whoever gets in. So we had a workshop, and it was myself, Ian McFadgen, Glenn Robbins, Marianne Fay, all those people.
Mark Mitchell,
Alan Pentland, a bloke called Eddie Zandberg,
Elliot Goblet, or Jack Levi.
A lot of people. So we did some work, did some sketches, and I think might have even filmed a couple, just sort of with handy cams as they were at the time, and in any event, we sold them. Seven said, "We'll do it. We'll do a limited show, 8 episodes. We'll call it." So that was us. We were the ones that got up. So we called ourselves the 11th Hour, and that we were that group of people. We did a sketch comedy show, and it was in the tradition of not the 9 o'clock news or, this was the week that was David Frost, very UK kind of based sketch comedy shows, topical, what was going on with characters. And we'd all known each other from the traps, from uni. That's how we got to do it. So we did that show. We would literally had no resources. Seven's promise was you could use this tiny little studio. You can use it on a Friday afternoon to shoot some stuff, and then the thing will go out that night, an hour show. We literally shoot an hour show of sketches that afternoon. So I remember I was supposed to be a lawyer. I'd sort of took those 8 Fridays off. I was the head writer.
You just took the one day off.
Took the one day off. And Ian was the producer. And we would go in there with a handful of sketches. I don't think we even rehearsed them. We just read them out once or twice and then shoot them. And then that was that one. And then we'd do another one. They were desk bound or shot in very tight locations. And so it went. And so in that little show, the 11th Hour, was kind of the prototypes of a lot of the characters that all of the performers would then take on to use in other shows in Fast Forward and in the Comedy Company. Mark did a prototype of Con the Fruiterer. Marianne did the prototype of Kylie Mole. Glenn did the prototype of Uncle Arthur. All of the characters that then kind of went on and became famous in primetime shows were tested in that little show. So it was a kind of very great opportunity and a seminal show for all of us. And apart from anything else, it gave us all this tape material. Not only did it give us an experience of working on TV and then seeing what worked and what didn't, because we'd watch it back and go, oh, geez, that's shit. Or, oh, that's what you do. Oh, that's how you do it. Because we were making it up. But it also gave us enough shot material to pull together a show reel that you could say, and you could show it to a network and say, this is what we're now wanting to do. So after that ended, it went nowhere. It was well received and it was a great experience. But I went back to being a lawyer and in fact, traveled overseas. And Ian picked up that and pitched it to 10. And originally it was going to be a sort of a nightly show, but they needed something to put up against 60 Minutes. So they put this show, The Comedy Company, which had pretty much half of the people that had been in the 11th Hour, about half.
Yes, Ian and Marianne.
But it didn't have Peter Moon or Alan Pentland or me or a few of the others. And it put that show up, 10 bought it, put it on air, and it was basically a suburban neighbourhood of people. It was a suburb full of people. So there was a greengrocer in it, a schoolgirl in it, all that sort of. Ian played a husband and wife, and so they had all of that stuff. It was a little suburban street full of people was the idea, or middle Australia. That became so popular, it knocked off 60 Minutes. It was the biggest show in TV at the time. So much so that Seven needed to do something to compete with it. And I was overseas, still being a lawyer, and I got the phone call from Gary Fenton saying, mate, the Comedy Company's gone ballistic. Would you do a show? And I said, yes, I would do a show, which is what ended up being Fast Forward. And so that was 1988, the end of 88. But the big idea I had, such as it was, I mean, if I've ever had a big idea, not really, but to the extent there was a big idea, the big idea was that whereas the Comedy Company, for example, was exploring sort of middle Australia and that, I was always fascinated with the power of the media. And so as we started talking this interview about media and how it's in everyone's room, fascinated with the idea that everyone's influenced as they were and still are, a different way, by screens and what they're seeing and what they're hearing and how that affects them. So the idea was simply a week in the life of TV, fast forwarded excerpts, the highlights, the lowlights, but the bits that stuck in a week of TV, given that's what everyone was watching in the whole of Australia, and that's all they watched. And so that was the idea. Ads included, news and current affair, variety shows, all of that was the mainstay, including reruns of old films, everything to do with the screen was the guts of the show. But then the other idea was, how do we make it pacey? So instead of having sketches, because I have a hate of things running too long, like this interview. So one of my things was, how do we get through stuff quickly? So the idea was being able to fast forward it, that's the name of the show. And also being able to change channels.
The channel change was one of the most brilliant devices, because if you didn't have a tag,
you change channels. And so we used that white noise thing. So the great idea, therefore, was you could go through any genre, any form of library material. So we did black and white old shows. We could go SBS with Mark Downey doing an SBS show. We could go into all of those foreign shows that they ran on SBS and have excerpts of those. And we could literally flick around and just have highlights and snippets and tastes of it all. So it became, therefore, several things. One, a show about the media and its power. Two, therefore, that could cover any aspect of that, from very highbrow, like foreign movies, to very lowbrow, Phil Donahue kind of audience shows. It would be very fast as a result of that. Very eclectic and very fast. So that was the show.
And you took some people from 11th Hour, say Peter Moon and later Glenn Robbins.
Yeah.
And then you got some people from D-Generation like Michael, Mark, Jane.
The D-Generation had, the girls were not, so the girls weren't in the D-Generation as much as they had been. So I think they weren't working at that point. The D-Gen had been at 7 and gone back to the ABC. But they appeared with the D-Gen. That's Mark Downey and Magda a little bit, but not so much Jane Turner. But that they were all colleagues at uni, and Marg had been at uni a bit after me, but not much. So I rang Marg and said, "Do you want to be in this?" She said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And so I rang Jane as well, and Magda. So therefore, the cast that we had at the start was Peter Moon, Alan Pentland, Michael Veet, Jeff Brooks, Steve Blackburn, Mark Downey, Jane Turner, Magda Zabansky, Ernie Dingo, because I thought it was important to try and do something so that we're using kind of First Nation stories, but not that we call them that in those days, so that there was a broader reflection. And in addition, I was really taken by topicality, and the ABC had just dropped these Peter Nicholson's,
yes,
who's a cartoonist. He brought his three-dimensional ways cartoons to life, called Rubbery Figures, which was very much like the UK's version, Spitting Images, where they did highly political cartoons using these puppets.
Yes.
And so because it's expensive to make, he'd only done 4 or 5 minutes. They weren't doing it anymore. So I went and approached him and said, "Would you do that for us?" But we needed a new take on that. So they had Hawke and Keating and John Howard and everyone, and John Elliott, who was Foster's, and the great puppets. And they were doing a satire with those, but they were all set in their environment. And the spin we wanted to put on was slightly different. Because we were doing more commercial, we took exactly those puppets but put them into films. So we put them into Star Trek, yes, for example, or we put them into something else, a different location. But we'd have exactly the same dynamic between Hawke, Keating. So it was a political still political, and they'd talk about political things, but it'd be wrapped up as though it was Star Trek or something. And so that became an element of the first couple of years of Fast Forward as well.
The process of Fast Forward, you had a live night, you had to make an hour a week.
So if you're making an hour of TV a week, an hour of sketches a week, there's a technical term for it. It's called a shitload. And so that is just a shitload of content that you have to churn out each week. I realized early that we needed several writers. In addition, one of the reasons I'd chosen that cast, or they'd agreed to join, and it was very collaborative, was that all of those people were, at least to some degree, writer-performers. Yes. They could either write their own material, or even if they couldn't write sketches, could give an indication to writers of what they found funny, or could do characters that the writers could work with. So they were writer-performers in some sense. And that's really important, I think. So we're already well down the track over just having actors. These were writer-performers. And they were experienced in sketch comedy. They were experienced at turning over material on a higher frequency. So then we got a whole lot of writers, and we started to stockpile sketches. And boy, would we write. Everything I saw, I was the head writer at the start, and everything, you're watching every news show. You're watching every bit of current affair. You're seeing movies. Every one of those is a sketch. And then I had the good fortune, because I knew that this was getting very hungry, and the network had renewed the show and said, we want more of this. I thought, oh, shit, Christ, we've just managed to get the first 8 out. And I'd quit my job as a lawyer, and I'd just got married. We'd just taken a mortgage on our house. So it was a big risk to set up a production company for 8 episodes. But I wanted to do it. So Sarah said, do it, which was very generous of her. But after 8 episodes, it had actually worked. The network said, we now want more. It had become the #1 show on the network, not just on that night, across the whole week. And in fact, at the end of the first series, it was the #1 show on TV. It had found its following, so they renewed it and said, we'll have another 13. So that would take us through to nearly the end of the year. So suddenly I thought, oh, shit, this is hard. We have to churn out a whole lot more. So I rang up Andrew Knight, who I knew had worked with the D-Gen as a producer and comedy writer.
One of the greats of this country.
Yeah, exactly my age. And we knew each other because he'd been to Monash, I'd been to Melbourne, and he'd done exactly what I'd done at Monash, writing material, putting on sketches and theatre restaurants, all of that. And then he'd gone to Crawford's and become a writer there and worked with John Clark and done stuff. But he was exactly doing what we were doing, but just on a slightly different trajectory. So I said, Andrew, come over. And he said, no, over my dead body. And he was going to go and work on a film because he wanted to get into films. But that film he wanted to work on had fallen over. So out of desperation for money, he came and said, all right. So we basically said, let's do it. And I think we just said, I just said, we'll do it 50-50. So we just did. And that became Artist Services. We literally set up Artist Services just over one meeting and a handshake. Right. We just started churning stuff out as best we could. And by the end of that, and the other key element I should have mentioned was Ted Emery.
Right, Ted Emery.
Ted Emery was the most experienced comedy director at the time, probably still is, putting yourself to one side, who'd come from the ABC, set up Countdown and done all of those Countdown episodes, which was the closest thing to kind of important live entertainment that had happened for many years, yes. Probably since Graham Kennedy and all of that. The ABC had taken over and produced Countdown, which was the new form of light entertainment for a whole new generation, all built around popular music. Ted directed all of that. He created the look for that, handheld, studio-based cameras, but with a real live feel of anything goes and cutting here, cutting there, using different spaces with live audiences. And like us, like Fast Forward, a once-a-week live show. So the mechanics were, just so we get this down, is that we would shoot each week as a fresh week. and we'd have a whole lot of sketches that came through, and we're getting those sketches a week in advance, 2 weeks in advance. But when a week approaches, we'd say, here's the sketches we're going to shoot this week. And they broke down into two sorts. There's sketches that are shot on location, or three sorts really. And you go and shoot a few things to give it a bit of a look. So it might be down on the, the beach. Or we're very close to the studio because we can't lose time on traveling.
That's right.
But we tried to make as many looks as possible, in town, around South Melbourne. We used every location around where the studios were to create different looks, including overseas or whatever. So there's OB sketches, they're called. Then we would do studio-based sketches as pre-records, where we're using the studio. We had one studio and a studio camera set up in there, but we'd have a couple of sets and we'd shoot things like we did a sketch called Brent's Smythe Barry, which was an advertising agency. We'd shoot those, or we'd shoot sketches that required little sets and get as many of them done as we could. And then we'd edit all of that up and we'd have a live night. And the live night was the night where the studio audience comes in. And in that live night, we'd record one big sketch, which was generally a thematic one, based on a big kind of media property, and it was a remake of something like Lost in Space or the Flintstones,
or the Monsters,
a movie,
Wind, or Kung Fu, memorably for you.
So we'd shoot that as a big sketch, and a couple of other little ones as well in front of the live audience, and they would love that. And in addition, we'd play on monitors, so we had to have really good screens, and we'd really try and focus their attention on watching them, because we were after a laugh track.
Yes.
All the material that we'd shot that week that was pre-recorded, which was both the OB stuff now edited up and the other studio-based sketches we'd edited up. So between that, we'd end up with probably an hour and a half of material, more or less, by the time we did that. And we were looking to hear what the audience engaged with. And we dropped the crap stuff. And in the sketches ran pretty much in their entirety, and we'd work out which parts of the sketches didn't work, and we'd chop them out, and then we put a channel change in, and that became kind of, we'd use the good bits of everything, in other words.
You and Andrew and Ted was also instrumental in all of that.
And Doug McLeod was another writer we had. We had some really great writers. Doug McLeod was probably a doyen of comedy writers who sadly died 3 years ago now, and very sadly missed. He wasn't old, and he was a great writer who was involved after all of these, after Full Frontal and all the shows we did. He then went and wrote on a Kath and Kim, for example, and he was a great award-winning children's book writer as well, and wrote children's series
and dramas.
Yeah, he wrote tons and tons of stuff. So he was a very esteemed writer. So he was involved, and so the one thing I'd say was, if you looked at that team of people, all of them were really talented and funny and dedicated people, not just the performers, but the writers and, the people like Brendan Luna. There's a whole list of other writers around as well, including the next year, Sean McAuliffe and Gary McCaffrey came over and started writing, and then eventually got on screen. But the writers were extraordinary. And the production team, including Ted and yourself and Kevin Carlin, and just this, all of whom have gone on to have stellar careers as directors and as producers and as whatever in the industry, but they are all focused in this tight team that worked really hard. And to say that we worked hard would be an understatement, because to get out an hour with, it wasn't a show where there were long sketches. We had lots and lots and lots of sketches. Each sketch has to have its own wardrobe. Each sketch has to have its own set, its own location. And if we're doing a parody of an existing show, which is more often than not what we were doing, then you have to recreate that look. So there's a technical overlay where someone's got to create that look, make it black and white or grainy or heighten the cinema, a heightened look. And then, if it's an existing show, you have to recreate, but not breach the copyright of the soundtrack of that, the music of that. So we had originally Paul Grabowski and then and then and a guy called Yuri Warrenchak, who would do the music behind all of that. So it looked and sounded like the Flintstones, or Get Smart, or Mr. Ed, or whatever the show was that you were doing. Yeah. So all that's got to be done concurrently. So the team that are working doing all these things, as it turned out, all became industry experts in it.
The resources at that time were a lot more limited. There was not even cable TV then. We had to hunt down VHSs of those things that we were parodying. So that was fast forward. How do you think the Australian comedy landscape has changed in the 30 plus years since?
Oh, it's changed infinitely. The landscape has changed dramatically. So when you think of it, when I was growing up as a kid, I came in at the year TV came into existence. So the year before I was born, the controlling medium in Australia was radio. Humour was kind of derived either from America or from the UK, but with an Australian overlay on it. And so the early days of TV, if we're talking about TV humour, were very much based on ensemble performances. So there was comedy. If you even go back further, there was IMT, essentially Graham Kennedy's show, was an ensemble. It was a troupe of people doing humour. That's what it was. It was a troupe of people doing a show, a variety show. Don Lane was a troupe of people. It was a variety show. That's what Australian comedy was. It was sketch comedy. Very rarely would you see a stand-up, one person on telly doing humour. Everything was ensemble based. And so when we came along, it was a kind of a modern extension of that. Yes. We picked up kind of what the British people, the new British version of that was all the young British comedians who'd done Monty Python or not the 9 o'clock news or the Frost Report, but they were still doing ensemble. It's still all about people. So our shows were group shows. Sketches written, all playing characters for the most part, and so it went. And the big change on through basically that kind of humour, that ensemble based humour, dominated Australian comedy through almost to the 2000s. Basically, when the new millennium came, it was only then, when the cost of productions went down, that there became now a focus on stand-up and individuals doing stand-up. And so I would say that was the biggest shift from ensemble-based shows to more stand-up-based shows that happened really at the turn of the millennium. One of the things about doing an ensemble-based show is that it's a character-based show. You're acting. So therefore, a whole lot of things happen when you're doing that. One is, if you've got a group of people, say 6 or 12 or whatever the number is, doing a show, then one, it's unlikely that any single view will prevail because it's group. Two, you get therefore you get a diversity of views in that show, because every actor and every performer and every writer, of whom there are many, has got their own views. Three, you get actors and performers doing characters. So it's clear that they're not being themselves. They're putting on an act, and in a wardrobe or with wigs, and clearly they're performing. So it's clear to an audience they are not being themselves. They are presenting an acted position that is not them. So not only are they getting a diversity of views of the performers, they're getting, in addition to that, a diversity of views of characters that the performers are doing. I think the main difference is that with stand-up, there's a big shift toward what's called authenticity, where people are celebrated for not only performing their own lives, but revealing their own lives, and it's them. There's no mistaking from an audience point of view. I'm engaged and being entertained by, albeit comedically, with that performer who is literally only doing his own life and whose experiences are kind of a heightened version, but limited to their own life and their opinions, and that's what I'm getting. And so not only are they saying raising issues like the rubbish trucks are always late, or airlines are bad, or the politicians are shit, or policies about this are bad, not only are they raising those, they're giving their own opinions as to how they should be resolved. So they're not only opening an issue, they're closing it with their own opinion.
So there you have it. That's how Fast Forward came into being. A huge thanks to Steve. We didn't even get around to his books and his plays and radio and various other things. That'll be in hour 17 probably. And of course, there'll be an episode on Tonight Live down the track. Speaking of books, he has Nation Memory Myth, a new book out now. You should grab yourself a copy and like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.